Greetings and welcome to the web presentation entitled Business and Operational Risks in Handling Pharmaceutical Information, also known as Business and Operational Risks in Clinical and Safety, Applying Appropriate Technology and Approaches to Mitigate Risk. I'm Adrian Hampshire, and I'm the Managing Director of BioPharm for the Europe, Middle East and African region. And I've just got to touch on a few housekeeping items before we get started. During the presentation, all participants are going to be on listen-only mode. However, you may and are encouraged to submit questions to the speakers at any time during the presentation by typing them into the chat box on the Ready Talk window at the bottom left-hand side. If time allows at the end of the session, then we will address the questions that have been posed by chat, by yourselves. If you still have unanswered questions at the end of the webinar or would like to request further information from BioPharm, please just complete the survey at the end of the presentation or simply visit our website for our contact information. As a reminder, today's call is being recorded and we'll post it up onto the BioPharm website within 24 hours, and we'll email you a link to the recording so that if you wish to share that with your colleagues or review the presentation again yourselves, you can do. So that concludes the housekeeping parts. So I would like to actually start the presentation formally. And the presentation is going to be in three parts. I will start by introducing some elements of business and operational risks that I think are important to consider, and then we'll look at two examples of how risk can be mitigated by implementation of systems. One will be presented by Param Singh, who's the VP of Clinical Trial Management Solutions at BioPharm, and the second will be presented by Rob van Manen, who is the Master Principal Sales Consultant for the Health Sciences Global Business Unit at Oracle Corporation. Let me just move on to the second slide. Okay, so let's start in a pretty traditional way by understanding what we mean by risk. And here I've picked up from the Oxford English Dictionary a definition of risk. So risk is a situation involving exposure to danger. Alternatively, it's the possibility that something unpleasant or unwelcome will happen. Both of those definitions of risks apply in business, as we're well aware, and businesses themselves must be fully aware and prepared for all business and operational risks if the business is to continue and survive in the longer term. Businesses face a very wide variety of risks. They can be at one end of the scale catastrophic risks such as fire or devastation of a plant or some sort, through product-related problems, loss of key staff, major systems failures, to regulatory audit findings, and many other risks in between. So organizations actually have to manage these risks, understand and manage these risks in great detail. So let's drill down and think a little bit more about what we mean by these risks. And in outline, I'd like to categorize the business operational risks in two ways. First in broad scope and second in narrow scope. And by broad scope, I mean what are the risks that you run as a business if you don't have a particular system in place to meet a particular requirement? So, for example, all companies will need suitable financial recording systems and processes in order that they can actually create and audit the books, the financial books that they use within the company. And if they fail to do that, then the outcome's pretty obvious. Companies that fail to manage financial information correctly will ultimately go out of business. If not through their own failure, then through regulatory closure. So that's what I mean by broad risks, having in place the systems that are necessary to do particular tasks or processes in the organization. And for our industry, a particular example of this would be in the safety world, where if as an organization, a pharma or biotech or CRO organization, you don't have some form of safety system in place that allows you to report in a timely manner and correct manner to the regulatory authorities, then as a business you have a serious problem. So that's what I mean by broader risks. Narrower scope, then obviously if we've decided that we need to put in systems to help manage the level of risks at the broader scope, then we actually then incur a narrower set of risks related to actually implementing those systems. The systems that we're talking about here, such as a safety system, can be pretty complex systems with pretty complex processes around them. And the more complexity there is in there, the greater the risk of failure when we actually undertake the implementation. And everybody who keeps in track with any newspapers will see major IT systems failure as a key item that occurs on a very regular basis. And I don't think I need to give any examples of that. They all come to mind pretty easily. So if those are the sort of categories of risks that we need to worry about, what else do we need to worry about? Well, we do need to worry about what happens if a risk occurs. A risk occurs, there is an impact. What is that impact on the organization? And obviously, if we've actually identified a number of risks, then the first question is, how can we reduce them? And this is certainly what all organizations should be doing in risk planning and risk management, whether it is for catastrophe-type management or whether it is any other sort of management. Observe the risks and work out how you can reduce them. You're never going to be able to reduce all risks to zero, so there will always remain some residual risk. And we have to work out then, what are we going to do about the residual risks? So now let's look at how this might relate to a clinical trial operation. So if we look at the key steps and processes involved in the clinical trial, and I've no intention of going through these in great detail, but you'll see that at the very broadest of levels, there are a large number of processes involved in executing a clinical trial. But what's common to all of these steps is that each of them involves an individual process that is more or less complex. These are not simple processes. These are generally pretty complex processes. Similarly, each of these processes is also supported or enabled by one or more IT systems or manual systems. Not everything in the world has to be an IT system. A manual process can be perfectly adequate, but in the case of the processes that I've listed, in general, the majority of these processes are actually supported by IT systems. So each of the steps, each in this process that I've identified here, carries a number of key risks. So if we now move on and look at what the broad risks are, what the key risks are, then we'll see that they fall into two categories. The first risk is the risks that the step in the clinical trial process or in any other process, the risks that the step is not undertaken at all, not executed at all. And if we look for a simple example, it may be that in a clinical trial, there is no process or system in place to monitor the safety, and therefore the patients that are actually undertaking the clinical trial are put at some level of risk. That's a step that is not undertaken at all, the risk. The second is that the step is undertaken, but it's executed either incorrectly or incompletely. So if, for example, the design of a clinical trial is inadequate or isn't appropriate, then the results of the clinical trial may just not answer the question that the study was designed to answer. And that's obviously a major risk, and that's a risk that we actually see quite frequently in clinical trials, and one reason why we spend so much time on trial design to ensure that we do get answers that, A, meet the questions that we ask, but also can be substantiated to do so. We do need a robust and a complete set of processes and systems to support all the clinical trial stages throughout the life cycle of a clinical trial. So when we then think about putting in place systems to actually manage these risks, then we are effectively making a change. And we all know that change is not an easy thing to achieve and has inherent to it major risks. So implementing any new process or system equals change, and change equals risk. And broadly speaking, the risks are at the strategic level, in other words, a risk that we may not have chosen the correct solution to fit with the business needs. They may be at the program level, so our individual solution doesn't fit with the overall program of solutions that we're putting together to meet a particular business need. They may be operational risks. So, for example, a staff may not be able to use the new system in order to be able to work the new process. Or there may be project risks, and these would be specific risks around implementing the project in terms of a new system. So, having identified a substantial number of risks, then we actually have to think about how we manage these. And we've said this before, but just to go over it again, there are 4 key actions. The first is we need to identify the risk. The second is that we need to assess the impact if that risk were to occur. The second is how do we actually, A, reduce the risk, the likelihood of the risk occurring at all, and B, the impact if it does occur. And then what do we do to handle all of those risks that cannot be completely eliminated? But I'd like to offer a 5th one. If we want to manage risk, one of the things that we may choose to do is actually outsource that risk to somebody else who is more experienced or more competent or more able and in a better position to deal with those risks on our behalf. And in our industry, we actually do this on a regular basis. So if we think about how a pharmaceutical company works, then frequently sponsors, biotech companies, pharma companies outsource trials to a clinical research organization, a CRO. And what they're doing there is essentially paying the CRO to take on the risk of running the clinical trial. And they do this because the CRO has arguably either greater experience or greater capacity to actually undertake the clinical trial, execute it successfully, and minimize the risk from executing the clinical trial. Now, whether it's the sponsor doing their own trials or the CRO themselves, both organizations also outsource the risk to the extent that what they do is instead of undertaking development of IT systems to support a process, they will frequently purchase commercially available software. And this essentially, what this does is to outsource a proportion of the risk of developing and implementing those systems to a developer or vendor of the system. And again, that's done for a price. So in both those cases, the organization that is apparently incurring the risk is able to offload a proportion of the risk and reduce the overall risk by involving experts of one sort or another. So the suppliers, whether the CRO or the system vendors, have executed the process many times or have built the software over a long period of time and consequently are able to deliver the software and run it at a much lower level of risk. The only caution to raise here is if we are outsourcing key parts of the clinical trial, we absolutely must be sure that everybody understands who remains the owner of the risk and takes responsibility for it. So you can't imagine that we could outsource a project to a CRO and the risks to a CRO, and then the CRO expects the sponsor still to maintain ownership of that risk. So if we now look at a little bit more detail, because this is the theme for the web session today, if we look a little bit more detail at commercial packages and how they can reduce the risk, one of the most important ways of reducing risk is using a pre-packaged solution or a commercial off-the-shelf software solution that then has a pre-configuration added to it. The reason why this reduces the risk substantially is it's essentially the pre-packaging is built on best practice. You have underlying a transactional system that is competent to do the job that it needs to do, and you layer on top of that a pre-configuration, pre-packaging that builds on best experience. And in most cases, those pre-packaged solutions, and we'll see one shortly, will deliver 80% of what the customer needs. And that gives the organization then the opportunity to very quickly get up to speed with a new system that meets 80% of their needs and can then focus on how do they want to meet the missing 20% of the needs. And of course, they can do two things there. They can either configure the solution further so that they meet that 20% extra, or indeed they could also change their processes so that their processes fit within the 80% that they're given using a prepackaged solution. Either way, the approach of using a prepackaged solution on top of a commercial off-the-shelf solution is that it greatly reduces the risk, because all the prior implementations and the design choices and all the changes that have been made to the project, they've already been done and have already incurred those risks. There's no need to make those again. Additionally, a lot of the validation and testing requirements have already been done, and thus there's no need to actually repeat these at the prepackaged solution implementation stage. All we have to do is worry about whether the prepackaged solution has been properly implemented. So this has a potential to speed up implementation by orders of magnitude. So for example, the Ascend solution that Param will talk about shortly potentially reduces implementation time from something like 8 to 10 months to 8 to 10 weeks. And the risks of doing the implementation are subsequently reduced very significantly. So now I want to move us on to looking at two particular examples, if this is a suitable point to move on from a general overview of risk. And the two examples we're going to have a look at are Ascend, and we're going to look here at how do we reduce risk by implementing a pre-configured version of Siebel Clinical, which is a complex CTMS solution. And the presentation of that is going to be done by Param Singh, who's the Vice President of Clinical Trial Management Solutions at BioPharm Systems. And after Param's presentation, we're going to have a look at two Oracle product areas, Argus Safety and Empirica Signal. And here we're interested in seeing how these commercial packages can, A, reduce the risk of undertaking the simple transactional level of safety reporting, but it also can help us meet the risk management drive that the regulatory authorities are asking pharmas and biotechs to take. And that's going to be presented by Rob Van Manen, Master Principal Sales Consultant at Oracle HSGBU. So I'm now going to turn the presentation over to Param to talk about the Ascend portion. Param.
Great. Thank you, Adrian. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. So as Adrian discussed, there are two primary risks associated with each step in the clinical trial process. One is the risk that the step in the process might be skipped entirely, and two, the risk that the step might be executed incorrectly or incompletely. For the steps in the clinical trial process that are supported by a CTMS helps mitigate the first risk by providing a central location or a system for all of those required tasks and information. When all of those tasks are performed in one place or one system, it's much harder to forget to perform any of those tasks. And with all the information in one place, it's much easier to recognize when a step or a task has not been completed. A CTMS helps mitigate the second risk by providing standardized, repeatable processes within the system. These are checks and balances in the system to ensure that the right tasks are being performed in the correct order. So in this section of the presentation, we're going to focus on how Siebel Clinical's design is particularly effective at mitigating risk because it's a template-driven system. A template is sort of an outline or checklist or list of tasks that is created once and then used, applied, or filled out over and over for each time you need to perform that same list of tasks. So an example of that is the list of tasks that we need to perform each time a new site is initiated, for example. These templates are flexible enough to adapt to any organization, and yet they support adherence to each organization's standard operating procedures. So in addition to the risks a CTMS helps you mitigate in your clinical trial management process, we'll also look at how a pre-packaged version of Siebel Clinical, an accelerator such as Ascend, can help to further mitigate the risk through the use of industry standards and best practices. So Adrian went through sort of a longer list of processes that are supported in the clinical trial process. We're going to cover some key areas in the clinical trial process that are supported by a CTMS, including the ways in which a prepackaged solution accelerator like BioPharm's Ascend solution can help further mitigate those risks in each of these areas. So these areas that we're going to cover today, managing investigators and targeting and recruiting high-performing investigators to participate on studies, setting up a repeatable, standardized site initiation process, including documents and activity lists for site initiation, standardized subject visit schedules and investigator payments for recruiting patients, standardizing the process for site monitoring, including checklists and questions, and setting up a repeatable, standardized site closeout process, again, including documents and task lists for a closeout. So let's get started. So when it comes to recruiting investigators, the first thing that we need to do is build enough data about the investigators and our relationship with them in our CTMS. So along with basic data such as geographic information and medical specialties, we'll also want to be able to track their ongoing performance on other clinical trials with our organization. But we don't want to allow users to arbitrarily track any information about that performance on previous trials. We want to be able to create a repeatable, objective process to assessing the performance of these investigators. And that's where we use assessment templates. Assessment templates in Siebel Clinical are a way to standardize the process for assessing the performance of the investigator by standardizing the criteria that is being assessed, as well as standardizing the values that can be entered for each criterion. So this is a way to ensure that an apples-to-apples comparison for assessments performed on potentially different investigators by different users for potentially different studies. So an example of what criteria you would assess this performance of your investigators might be your investigator's ability to recruit patients according to plan, or adherence to study procedures, where standard values could be tracking whether they had no protocol violations, a certain number of protocol violations, and significant protocol violations. So again, those standard values would be sort of in line with what you experience and what you define as significant protocol deviations, for example. So each of these values, when creating these templates in Siebel, would have their own sort of numerical score and weight. And when the user fills out that template for a particular investigator, the system will calculate a total assessment score. So the key here is again, to create objective, measurable criteria in relating that to your performance of your investigators. So this overall score can then be used in the application during a site selection process to review potential investigators and their assessment scores to narrow in on high-performing investigators for use in future trials. While one of the logical sort of times you would perform an assessment on an investigator would be at the end of a study, but the system will actually allow you to perform an assessment at any time in the study. So you can actually build your investigator database with information related to performance at any time within the study. What Ascend has done to build on Siebel Clinical's base assessment template functionality is to enhance the ability to query for investigators so that it includes things like assessment scores. In Siebel Clinical Vanilla, it's possible to query for investigators that meet each one of the criteria listed here, in terms of geographic location or patient population, specific experience, and assessment scores, but in Vanilla we're not able to do that simultaneously. So because the industry places such a high value on selecting the most appropriate investigators, BioPharm created an enhanced contact targeting functionality that builds on Siebel Clinical's powerful querying functionality. So Ascend allows you to do this complex searching to return a very focused list of potential high-performing investigators that we have experience with in our organization, and thus minimizing qualification efforts and ensuring smoother, more efficient trials. Now let's discuss the site startup process. So during the site startup process, typically our clinical SOPs will dictate the specific tasks and activities that need to be performed, as well as documents that need to be tracked as part of that process. The Siebel Clinical activity template functionality allows organizations to essentially embed their SOPs within the system. Activity templates are entered in the system once to account for all activities, tasks, milestones, and documents specific to, say, site startup events. And so when a site startup event occurs, users need only apply the existing template and track that standard list of activities and documents and tasks. So this ensures that the process is standard and repeated according to the SOPs across all of your sites for your studies. So it ensures that users adhere to the SOPs, and it minimizes the risk of missing any part of that specific process. For organizations that have varying SOPs for different types of studies or for different business units, you can specify different templates for those different business units as well. So the system allows for standardization of these processes, but it still allows enough flexibility to allow for multiple templates across multiple business units or multiple different types of studies. Ascend has taken that vanilla functionality on of separate documents and activities views within Siebel Clinical and enhanced each of those views to include certain fields that only apply to, say, tracking of activities and tasks versus tracking documents. So we've tailored each of these views to include specific dates and statuses that our users are interested in tracking, thus streamlining both of those areas in the system. Also, we've also configured an enhanced document tracking screen, which is basically where all of the documents or activities that have ever been tracked in the system can be viewed across all of your studies across multiple programs. So this overall roll-up view, or this screen, allows users to view and filter the entire list of documents. So we're able to see specific documents that were created at each level of the hierarchy. So if a user wanted to see, for example, all site documents across all protocols within the system that are set to expire in the next 30 days, they're able to do that search in Ascend based on these enhanced views. Now let's discuss the recruiting patients process. When tracking patient recruitment, a CTMS should allow to track patients according to the patient visit schedule and procedures and activities per visit as it's defined in the actual protocol design or protocol document. The way Siebel ensures that we're following that prescribed subject visit schedule is through the use of a subject visit template. So the subject visit template, or SVT, standardizes the visit schedule and list of procedures or milestones and tasks that are tracked for each subject. So this SVT also allows us to standardize the payment amounts for each of those visits and procedures that are performed by the investigators. So once these templates are created during the protocol setup process, they can be further modified at the site level to allow for specific changes in, say, payment amounts for procedures and visits that are to be paid for. So again, the template functionality allows enough capability to standardize these visits and these payments across the entire protocol, but then the system still allows enough flexibility to make payment exceptions at that site level. This setup ensures that we are paying the correct amounts for each completed subject visit or procedure, and it has enough functionality to ensure that we're not overpaying or double paying for these activities. The system can then automate the payment process based on activities that are completed at the site for the screened and enrolled patients. Once the system is integrated with an EDC or a clinical data management system, which is one of the sort of high priority interfaces that we see with a CTMS, this entire process for completing subject visits and activities and actually getting things ready for payment to the investigator can be fully automated from the completion of those activities and visits and actually generating the proper payments for those completed activities. And that takes potential human error and potential lag components out of that process. So that's going to ensure that we are paying our investigators correctly, accurately, and in a timely manner, thus managing a very effective relationship with our investigators. In vanilla, when the subject visit template is applied to a site, IRB approval date and informed consent dates at the subject level are linked. This can streamline the process of applying the SVT, but that doesn't account for situations where in which a protocol gets amended, but not the subject visit schedule. So if we're amending a protocol, for example, and it doesn't require IRB approval or new informed consent dates, it doesn't necessarily account for that. So as I'm sure you know, anytime a protocol is amended, it may or may not require IRB approval. So this can be recorded in your CTMS. But in vanilla, it's sort of tied to your subject visit template. So what we did in Ascend is allow for scenarios where you can be modifying your subject visit schedules, modifying your payments, where it doesn't reflect anything on your IRB approval dates or your informed consent dates. So this mitigates the risk of having potentially the wrong informed consent date or the wrong IRB approval date associated to a template. Additionally, Ascend has the ability to track treatment arms for each subject as well, and to change that treatment arm at any time throughout the study. So Ascend allows for treatment arm sort of capability within the system. Ascend also allows for detailed tracking of subject-related protocol deviations and adverse events. So from a monitoring perspective, anytime we have a protocol deviation or a violation, or again, monitoring adverse events, Ascend has that capability. So all of these enhancements allow for more focused, compliant tracking and increased visibility into what is happening during each of these trials. When looking at the process for site visits and monitoring, these are also typically defined by monitoring SOPs that are in place in your organization to guide the CRAs and monitors through a checklist that lists out the expected tasks, questions, steps that they have to perform while they're on the site visit. The system allows for multiple types of trip report templates. Typically, one is set up for each type of site visit. So whether that's qualification, initiation, routine monitoring, or site closeout. So these help to ensure that all users are performing site visits, are following the same process and adhering to the defined process and not missing any steps. In some cases, your organization may have, again, multiple types of studies or multiple business units where that process for monitoring may differ from each business unit. The system allows us to create multiple trip report templates for each type of study or each business unit as well. So again, this functionality not only allows us as an organization to use the system to standardize the process across the board and ensure that you're enabling your SOPs within the system, but it still allows enough flexibility to allow for those potential differences in the process across business units or type of study. So this is really the power of a system like Siebel Clinical. In Ascend, what we've done around the trip reports, the questions included in the trip report template are actually separated out into checklist questions and narrative questions. This separation between sort of checklist items and narrative questions allows us to ensure appropriate response for each type of question. Also, the Ascend trip report allows protocol deviations, serious adverse events, site follow-up issues, and CRF tracking records to be imported as a snapshot into the trip report as well. These imported records are essentially copies of original records, which means that if after a record has been imported into the electronic trip report, the original record is updated, the record in the trip report remains unchanged. So we're truly capturing a snapshot in time of what those items look like at the site during that site visit. So in this way, the trip report serves as that true snapshot in time that includes several important details about the status of the site during that site visit. Additionally, the Ascend trip report includes a section that automatically records and displays the approval history of the trip report. So this approval history is like basically an audit trail of the trip report that addresses the requirements laid out in 21 CFR Part 11 for electronic approvals and signatures. So just as the startup phase is enabled through activity templates, so is the closeout phase. So you have activity templates specific to closeout tasks, and that's not specific to sites, but also for regions or countries or the protocol or study itself. So these activity templates can be country-specific, just like the startup template. So when we have a list of activities or documents that are specific to a specific country, when we're talking about global studies, we can actually enable the system to carry out those tasks that are specific to a particular country underneath that region setting. So when we're creating templates, we could create a template for U.S. studies and another template for European studies, for example. So when we have variances in the process that's defined for global studies in those regions, the system actually allows us to do those tasks separately from within the same study on those different regions for those different sites. And additionally, Siebel's unique roll-up views allow for excellent visibility into all of the child records of the study as well. So this is particularly useful during closeout, so you can actually see what's been completed and what's left to be done. So for example, when we're talking about sort of closing out the study and reconciling, all of the follow-up issues, all of the site supplies, all of these things that we were actually managing at the site level, the system gives you visibility into that reconciliation on a site-by-site basis, as well as from a study manager perspective or a regional study manager perspective, you can see and do all of that reconciliation at the highest level at the study. So in Ascend, the enhancements that assist with closeout process are same as those that we talked about during the startup process as well. It's utilizing the same functionality, but applying different templates. So there's different procedures, different SOPs that are enabled within the system, within those templates, and that you'll be able to track within your activities and documents during that closeout phase. So in conclusion, I hope that having some of the topics related to CTMS, it's clear how implementing a CTMS can help mitigate some of that risk in clinical operations by providing that central location to capture clinical trial management information and manage the CTMS, the clinical trial management process. In addition, how Siebel Clinical and its unique template-driven design is particularly helpful in mitigating that risk in clinical trial management. And then finally, how a prepackaged version of Siebel Clinical, such as the Ascend Accelerator solution, can further mitigate risk by delivering additional enhanced industry-driven functionality enhancements out of the box without additional development effort. So I'll wait till the end of the entire presentation to take any questions. And now I'll pass it to Rob, who's going to discuss Argus safety and Empirica signal. Rob?
Thank you very much, Param. As already mentioned, I'll be talking about the safety aspects of risk management. And I'll particularly be focusing on two of these aspects. One is the processing aspect. The aspect related to processes and making sure that processes run correctly and provide the desired outputs. But in addition to process-related risk aspects, which people have been looking at in the past for quite a long time, there are also the aspects associated with the product itself, product-related risks. And of course, no company wants its product to see removed from the market. So there's a very important product-related aspect here that is becoming more and more important, as we'll see in a moment. So what I'll talk about is, first of all, the case processing side, which is served by a case processing system, which can help mitigate issues such as not complying with adverse reaction regulations, things like not reporting cases. And when you look at the FDA warning letters, you'll actually see that still very regularly the FDA sends out warning letters to companies for failing to report specific cases, for example, cases of deaths, but also other serious adverse events related to specific drugs or devices, or simply failing to comply with the reporting deadlines. And that's another very frequent subject of FDA warning letters, companies that have submitted safety cases, but sometimes way outside the deadlines imposed by the regulatory authorities. The other risks, the product-related risks, are much more associated with the failure to detect adverse reactions in a more systematic way. So adverse reactions that are in some way related to a product, and which could be associated with the fact that companies don't see the data at all, they don't get the data, they don't accumulate the proper data, or they don't correctly assess the potential signals that present themselves as statistical information from a medical perspective. Or they may have seen the signals, but simply fail to take action, or even when they do take action, fail to document it. So authorities may come in and ask them about the reasons why a specific signal was approached in a certain way, and they simply won't have an answer because they haven't properly audited and documented their activities. So to start with the first part, the case processing side, I will focus on a number of activities. Of course, the case processing activities can be fairly complicated and can involve a lot of actions, but I'll focus on the 4 major actions around case processing, which is the initial collection and entry of the data, the coding of data. This could be the coding of drug names, coding of medical terms, but also coding of lab values, for example, or medical history. Then there's the medical review, which determines, among other things, usually the actual reportability of the case, how it should be reported and where it should be reported, and ultimately the reporting process itself. And in looking at these different process steps and realizing that a general safety case would have to go through all of these steps, an important aspect of the case processing system already comes to mind, and that is the whole workflow side, because the last thing you would want is let's say a case with an uncodable term to be stuck in the coding phase and be stuck there for a long time, for such a long time that you might miss your ultimate reporting deadline because of it. Or because the clinical staff are so busy, other cases might get stuck in the medical review phase. So what is important here, even in just listing the different process steps, is to realize that there must be a mechanism to make sure that cases progress properly and promptly through these steps, with the focus on the ultimate reporting date being within the regulatory deadline. Focusing on that first step, you may wonder, what is special about data entry? But there are actually a lot of things that can go wrong, even at this relatively simple initial step. And I mentioned a number of risks and a number of safeguards here. Incomplete data, simply missing to enter some information, in some cases key information. It could be the key information that designates an adverse reaction report, which is an identifiable patient, an identifiable product, an identifiable event, and an identifiable reporter. But there could also be other missing key information, which may only turn out to be important later on. It could be that the medical history of a patient might be an important aspect of a signal because, let's say, certain adverse events only occur in patients that have a history of liver problems, in which case you want to make sure that that history is being captured. So to capture data in an as complete as possible format is an important role of that case processing system, to make sure that every potential element that is relevant for not only assessing the individual case, but also assessing a potential signal behind that case is captured and stored within the system. Then there's a simple aspect of data correctness. And of course, the actual correctness of the data is difficult to check, but certain data elements can be obviously incorrect, in which case then they can be captured and they can be dealt with, preferably as quickly as possible. Examples are dates, numbers, character data that is entered where a number should be entered. Things like upper and lower boundaries, a blood pressure of 5,000. These things do happen when people enter data into systems. There could be typos, there could be information that was somehow transferred incorrectly from paper. And it is important to capture this type of errors as quickly as possible, as close to the source as possible, because it might be the case that the original reporter is still on the phone, is still in the building, is still around to ask questions. And that, of course, greatly facilitates the resolution of these issues. The third type of issue, data consistency checking, in a similar vein, would look at things like starting and ending dates. Is an ending date always after a starting date? If continued exposure to a drug or a continued event is indicated, then the starting date, of course, the ending date should not be specified. There are many, many things that could cause inconsistencies in the data. Maybe a case is flagged as serious, but none of the serious criteria have been identified. So why would that case be serious? All these inconsistencies, incorrectness, and incompleteness aspects of the data can be addressed to a very high degree by a case processing system, and can also be addressed quickly at the moment of data entry. As I said, the reporter can still be contacted and asked for clarification whenever possible. The next step is also a very important step. The coding step has always been an important step, of course, in identifying exactly things like adverse events and drugs associated with an adverse event case. But with the advent of signal detection technologies and signal detection approaches, coding has become even more important, because often it's the coded terms that are being used in the quantitative signal detection processes. And there are examples. I've come across some of these myself where a drug would have a completely different safety profile from other drugs in the same class. And upon investigating these situations, it often turns out that the actual safety profile is very similar, but it looks different from a signal detection perspective only because of different coding approaches. So coding, and correct and consistent coding, is very, very important, not only for the assessment of the individual case, but also for the proper assessment of potential signals that could be generated later on when multiple cases have been collected. And there are ways of addressing incorrect coding, or at least limiting the potential for incorrect coding. For example, to use an autoencoder, using a consistent method. And this isn't just a simple text match. Modern autoencoders have very powerful multi-step coding algorithms that do things like remove numbers, remove bracketed terms, change word order, etc., to come up with a coding match and even an associated reliability assessment of that coding match for a wide variety of verbatim terms. And then, of course, autoencoders are systems, are procedures, so they cannot get everything right. So it's always necessary to use coding review procedures, to review a certain proportion of the coding, both automatic and manual, to make sure that that coding is correct and is consistent. Consistent coding is also supported by the use of synonym lists. So if a specific verbatim term is coded in a specific way once, a synonym list can assure that that same verbatim term is coded in the same way in the future. And a similar functionality is provided by code propagation capabilities. In case large numbers of cases are all coded at the same point in time, then, let's say the same verbatim term occurs in many of those cases, then once the coding has been performed for one of those terms, this coding can be propagated across all the occurrences of that verbatim term within the set of cases that is being coded. After coding, the next step that usually follows is the medical review step, in which the clinician, someone with a medical background, reviews the case, assesses the adverse events and the drugs, and on the basis of that, for example, assesses the reportability, and also generally provides a review information, a medical review for that case. So there are a number of risks associated with this, of course. One is clearly the incorrect assessment of reportability. For example, because the information about adverse events had not been presented properly, was not available in an easily accessible way, or whether information about concomitant medication was sitting, let's say, on a different page in the system, and the reviewer simply forgot to access that page, so now that information was missing from the whole assessment process. So what is important for that medical assessment is to make sure that all the information necessary for that assessment is available to the assessor in an easily accessible way. So there's no omissions in terms of relevant aspects such as concomitant medication, medical history, the drugs in question, and also the adverse events in question. And then, of course, the medical assessment needs to be captured. And preferably that shouldn't be, I think nowadays it's not a piece of paper anymore. I think nobody just uses paper and nothing else. But it also shouldn't be like a spreadsheet or a Word document. Preferably it should be integral to the system and part of that case. So all the information of the case will include that medical assessment. And it will also have an audit trail associated with it. So years later, it will always be possible to look at an individual case and say, okay, who performed the assessment and when was that assessment performed? Looking at the final step, at least the ones that we're looking at in the process of the regulatory reporting, this is actually until, let's say, a few decades ago, all that pharmacovigilance was about. We're just looking at getting those reports out on time, getting those reports to the regulatory authorities within, let's say, for example, the FDA 15-day deadline. And that was the main activity in the pharmacovigilance arena. And of course, associated with that ultimate reporting process, there are a number of risks. I already mentioned the fact that you can miss a case completely, but you could have a case in the system, but miss sending out a report. Maybe because for a specific country, it was simply not known that this case needed to report it there. Particularly for larger companies with many drugs on the market in many countries, the reporting situation can be extremely complex because, of course, the regulatory requirements for reporting are different in different countries. And it ranges from very strict requirements up to like 3-day reports or 7-day reports in specific cases to countries that, on the other hand, don't require any reporting at all, and where the regulatory authorities actually get annoyed if you send them reports, particularly large quantities of reports. So it is important to, for each individual case, assess which countries does this case have to be reported in based on the drug, whether the drug is on the market in the country, the seriousness of the case, which is often an important aspect, whether or not the adverse event is expected or not. Those all contribute to the reportability of a case. But in specific countries, there are other aspects that may contribute to that as well. And of course, the best way to minimize the risk of incorrect reporting is to have a system that can automatically suggest the proper reports based on documentation on the regulatory requirements in all the individual countries where a drug is on the market. And that type of information can be captured in a reporting matrix with the recipients as the columns and the drugs as the rows, where you can simply say, okay, for this specific drug in the United States, I need to report cases which are serious and unexpected. That matrix can then, once it's implemented, automatically drive reporting requests to go out and, potentially after manual review, drive the reporting process to the regulatory authorities without the need for any individual to remember all those complicated requirements and apply them manually. A report submitted too late, as I mentioned, quite frequently still a subject of FDA warnings, which can be addressed with things like tracking individual reports once they have been requested, reminder capabilities to remind people that the reports still need to be approved, for example, before they can go out. There's always, of course, the balance between automating processes as much as possible, which will make them generally faster, and on the other hand, allowing for manual intervention, which will require manual approvals and slow down processes dependent on the availability of the approver. Incorrect report types, not sending an expedited report, but incorporating a case in a periodic report instead, which could have something to do with the reportability assessment. It could be, for example, that a reporter might have missed one of the FDA always serious terms. Or a reporter might simply have missed the fact that there happens to be this one country where this case needs to be reported. So the combination of proper reportability assessment with having automatic report requests can help mitigate this type of risk. And then, of course, you may still be confronted with authorities that ask you about your reporting practices, for example, during an audit, or they may have a suspicion that there may be missing reports, and they come to you and ask you for your reporting over the last 6 months or over the last year. In order to answer such questions, it is important to have report tracking and auditing capabilities so you can easily present authorities with an overview of what was reported during a specific time period for which drugs, how many cases, what type of reports, what dates, etc. So report tracking and auditing is very, very important to deal with those questions that are asked actually quite frequently by authorities from individual companies. Okay, we will switch gears now and move from the process side to the product side. So we're going to look into signal detection. And there are two things that I wanted to mention here. First of all, of course, that regulators are talking about signal detection, as we all know. They've published guidance documents, and they're actually in the process of turning some of these guidances into requirements. But I'd say almost as important, or even more important perhaps, is the fact that they are currently doing it themselves. Regulators are doing quantitative signal detection, and there have been several situations where regulators have confronted companies with potential signals that apparently these companies were not aware of. So looking at the guidances, first of all, there have been guidances for signal detection, for safety monitoring in general, for many years. Actually, the FDA came out with a series of important guidances in 2005, for example. The guidances that I'm showing here are European ones, EMA guidances, focusing on, and they're very explicit, focusing on methodological standards for signal detection from NCEP, and also a number of work instructions from the EMA that all have to do with the detection and the management of potential signals. So this is what the authorities are broadcasting to the outside world. We're looking into this, and we're expecting you to perform certain activities in these areas. And the same thing actually happens not just by the authorities themselves, but also in the form of many initiatives, either cross-authority or in the form of public-private initiatives. And I've only mentioned a few here. There's actually a whole flurry of activity around the signal detection world. I mentioned here NCEP. You saw some of the guidelines on the previous slide were coming from NCEP. The PROTECT initiative, which is like a European counterpart of the US-based OMOP initiative, which looks at the development of methods and standardized methods and approaches for detecting, among other things, safety signals in data. And this is a consortium that consists of both regulatory authorities and academia, and also representatives from the pharmaceutical industry. And then there's the EU ADR project also focusing on signal detection, finding adverse reactions sooner in association with drugs on the European market. In the US, of course, there's, first of all, there was PDUFA 4, and the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, which had a number of sections that dealt with signal detection and the need for signal detection. And it led to the foundation of the Reagan-Udall Foundation, that is an organization focused completely on earlier detection of issues with drugs. There's the FDA Sentinel and Mini-Sentinel project, where the FDA actually collects data from database owners based on queries that they send out to use in their safety assessment. And there's OMOP, which I already mentioned, another public-private partnership to develop standards, database standards first of all, data formatting standards, and on top of those, methodological standards for the detection of drug-related safety issues earlier and also more clearly on the basis of that data. And then there's an initiative in Japan called MIHARI, which is also associated with the development of tools and methods for earlier detection of safety signals. Now, of course, all these initiatives and also the guidances that we've seen, as I say, are not yet regulations, and even many of the guidances actually talk about signal detection in a fairly vague way. They just say the companies need to do signal detection, but they don't tell you exactly what you need to do. And so there are many companies that are perfectly happy in looking over listings, line listings, PSURs, CMS line listings, and manually assessing whether there is a signal or not, or maybe looking at individual case series. The scary aspect of that is that the authorities that have also been doing the same things for a long time have now, already since actually since the year 1997, when it all started in the US, have been doing their own signal detection. And as a result of that, I'm giving you 2 web pages here that are the result of their signal detection activities. First of all, the FDA has got a quarterly posting on the web of potential signals, and they tell you, they're not doing anything in terms of regulatory action on the basis of this information, but it does tell you that these are drugs and adverse events that they are focusing on, and they're doing signal detection on, and they're trying to find out what is going on with this drug and this adverse event. And there have been several companies, in my own experience, that were suddenly, unexpectedly confronted with an appearance of one of their drugs on this list with a specific adverse event, and then came to specialized companies or came to us and asked us, could you please look into this and help us find out what the FDA were looking at, because we don't have the tools or the systems to find out what is really going on with that drug. And it's not just the FDA in the US doing these things. If you look at the website of the MHRA, this is our own MHRA in the UK, then there are these drug analysis prints which give an overview of the most common suspected reactions to drugs. And those drug analysis prints actually originate from a system that is the same system as the FDA are using. So the MHRA has got the same system at their disposal as the FDA to perform safety signal detection. And if you actually look at what is currently done by regulators, in terms of simply what is available to these reviewers, to these medical reviewers of safety signals in terms of systems and products, this is just a selection of the systems that authorities are using. You see, at the FDA, not only for drugs, CDER, but also for biologicals in CBER, for medical devices in CDRH, and even for food products in CIFSAN, they use a signal detection environment in production, so on a daily basis, available to all reviewers to perform quantitative signal detection and to use tools like visual, graphical representations of signals in order to assess the safety of products that are on the market. And actually, the FDA are doing the same thing with clinical studies as well. If you submit your data for a clinical study for a submission to the US, and you do that in the SDTM format, then the first place where it will go is into a signal detection system that will allow FDA reviewers to look at the data that you have presented to them and, for example, look for statistical differences between your control group and your treatment group, and do that in a systematic fashion. So any type of difference that shows up, not just adverse events in this case. For clinical trials, they look at lab data, they look at vital signs, they look at all kinds of different aspects for these patients. And if they then find that you have submitted data for a trial, but, for example, all the liver enzymes of your patients in the treatment group are going out of control, then you may have a problem there. And you would hope that you'd have noticed that yourself. But there may be hidden issues that will only show up through these quantitative signal detection processes. EMA, using an in-house developed tool focusing on a signal score called the PRR, which was developed by Steve Evans from the MHRA, actually. MHRA using, as I mentioned earlier, the same tool as the FDA, and the drug analysis prints are extracted directly from that tool within the Sentinel environment. The PMDA, which is developing as part of the Mihari initiative their own in-house tools, and many other countries such as the Netherlands, where in-house quantitative signal detection tools are used to also do the same thing, perform quantitative signal detection against a database of over 100,000 Dutch safety cases. So what can we say in conclusion about the signal detection risks and safeguards? Non-compliance with current regulatory guidelines is a risk. You might say, okay, it's just a guideline, so we don't really have to do it. But of course, it could still have a negative impact if regulators discover signals that you're not aware of. And also upcoming regulations, because regulators are in the process of turning these guidelines into more and more strict and specific regulations, where they don't just talk about going over line listings and PSURs, but they're actually going to talk about specific quantitative safety signal detection techniques. And then, of course, there's the significant risk of regulators identifying signals that a company may not be aware of. And as I said, this could catch companies by surprise, and it has happened that companies were caught completely by surprise by a signal coming completely out of left field that a regulator had found. And in general, one would say that it's preferable for a company to find these signals themselves, of course, to anyone else finding them, not just a regulator, but also the general public. one of the largest users of one of Oracle's signal detection systems actually did an analysis of drug-related issues before the introduction of quantitative signal detection techniques and after the introduction of these techniques. And they found that before they introduced their own quantitative signal detection, about 20% of drug-related issues were found internally by the company themselves, and about 80% were reported to them either via the general public or by most of them by the regulators. After the introduction of quantitative signal detection techniques, that ratio actually reversed. So it means that now 80% of issues associated with their drugs are found by the company themselves, and they can take appropriate action before other regulators or the public find these issues. And only 20% are currently brought to their attention by outside sources such as regulators and the general public. So in general, in terms of safeguards, of course it is important to implement not just a system. It's not all about having the software. It's all about having the proper processes supported by the system. Processes for quantitative signal detection, but also for managing signals, for dealing with the potentially very large volume of drug event combinations that a signal detection system may spit out and that you may have to deal with. And then document all those activities around signals as well. Document the signal itself, document how the signal was assessed, and also document any actions taken on the basis of that signal. And of course, with the regulators doing signal detection themselves and doing data cleaning themselves in very specific ways, another safeguard would be to focus on those methods and systems that are actually used by the authorities themselves. So you can get to see the same signals, the same representations, the same data as the authorities see themselves. Okay, that's my presentation, and I would like to now invite questions. I think questions go through the chat, and we have a number of questions already. So, in order, yes, so I would like to pass back to you to deal with those questions.
Very much, Rob. Thanks very much for that, and I'll take over from this point. That's great. So I hope that we've given everybody a pretty good overview of business risk around systems, processes, and how critical this is for organizations to get on top of, whether it's for their own survival or for meeting regulatory requirements. So as Rob says, we have some questions in. We have 3 questions in that I want to put to Param for the CTMS side. Rob, you'll know that we don't actually have any questions on the safety and signal detection management side. So I invite anybody who wants to add any more questions to please submit those through chat. You've got time while we answer the first questions to put any questions to Rob. Meanwhile, let me go through the 3 questions that we've got on the CTMS side. So the first question, and these are going to Param to answer, is has there been any progress with linking the clinical trial database with the pharmacovigilance database? This would allow for a single source of data entry and generally avoid the nightmare, and I'm sure we all agree it's a nightmare, of reconciliation. Param.
Okay. So, all right. So we sort of get related questions like this a lot. I guess when implementing CTMS, either in a custom scenario or in an Ascend solution scenario, roughly I would say there's a clear divide, a 50-50 divide of whether organizations are actually going to be tracking high-level adverse event information as they monitor it within the CTMS. The only time that organizations actually do track that within their CTMS is particularly from a monitoring perspective, and particularly for that reconciliation process. So it's really a clear divide between organizations that even want that information in their CTMS. They, essentially, if they have a process, from a safety perspective for clinical trials, and it basically goes directly into their safety process and into their safety system, and they're not really worried about capturing that in the clinical trial management system, But if they are, we've in Ascend, we've created a capability to track basic high-level information about those adverse events that are related to clinical trials that we monitor. So, basic things about, the dates that it occurred, maybe the event name, and when it was reported to safety, when it was identified by the site, by the monitor, et cetera. So in those cases, we do have, again, we've built out a capability to, if we wanted to link the systems, and again, particularly for just that reconciliation piece, we have built a system with a reference ID of the case number in your safety system, for example, your Argus system or AIRS or whatever safety system you have. So in the past, what we have done is allow for a cross-reference, as it were, between the adverse events that you've monitored versus the adverse events that are in the system for that particular product, for, as it relates to the clinical trial. So you can actually reconcile to say, the system will actually reconcile for you to say that, we've reported in the safety system 4 adverse events, serious adverse events, but from a monitoring perspective, we have 5, so we need to chase down that one that we've monitored and we don't necessarily see in our safety system, or vice versa. So it's really in there, built in there for that reconciliation purpose to ease that process of reconciliation. And that's where we've done those integrations, between CTMS and the safety system. But again, I would say that it's a pretty clear sort of 50% want to do that reconciliation, still maintain that reconciliation, and want that capability within CTMS, and other organizations rely solely on just their safety process and not really deal with that information directly in their CTMS.
Thank you, Param. The second question to you is, how do companies handle entering non-clinical trial data into CTMS Ascend? And here the questioner is referring to data around epidemiology studies, health outcome studies. How is that entered into a CTMS? Okay.
So, I think that when we look at Siebel Clinical, it is a clinical trial management solution. So the focus and sort of the depth and breadth of the functionality that we see in Siebel Clinical and in the Ascend solution is particularly focused around clinical trials. With that said, that's not to say that a lot of the functionality that's there can't be utilized in health outcomes and epidemiology studies, non-clinical trials, essentially, because what we're talking about is, particularly in the presentation today, we talked about sort of enabling SOPs, managing activities, tasks, documents in a repeatable process. So that particular functionality within the system can still be utilized within the system and make it very, effective use of CTMS for those types of studies as well. For those studies, you're not going to use, again, the depth and breadth of the functionality, but particularly at the protocol level, at the region level, when we're talking about sort of those repeatable processes and things that we need to do as part of managing those tasks and documents, et cetera, and even down to the investigator level, we do have a lot of capability that can be utilized. It's just that you may not be utilizing a lot of sort of the deep functionality around sites and patients. And with that said, organizations that run multiple types of studies, still utilize that functionality along with their clinical trials, just to have that central location for all of their clinical trials. So, everything rolls up to that higher level in the same way. So rather than having your clinical trials in Siebel CTMS and managing, these other types of trials outside of CTMS, you can still utilize the functionality and maybe even enhance the functionality to support the processing and tracking that you need to do for the non-clinical trial. So we've seen that work pretty well for organizations that run multiple, different types of studies.
Thank you. Third question, again a CTMS one, is the number of site data queries included as part of the assessment score?
Right. So the beauty of the assessment template is that your organization gets to define it, right? So really anything and everything that you want to assess the performance of an investigator, or even the site as a whole, or even if you use vendors like CROs, you can actually do performance assessments on contract research organizations and their ability to run your trials effectively. So the criteria that you decide is purely up to you. So in the past we've seen criteria such as ability to recruit subjects according to plan, adherence to study procedures, turnaround time for issues, SAE reporting, turnaround, and even query rates. So particularly with query rates, you can have I guess assessment values, high, medium, low, or a little bit more measurable sort of criteria around query rates that would contribute to the overall assessment score of that investigator. So the answer is yes.
Okay, and the final question thus far, again it's a CTMS question, Param, is Ascend offered as a SaaS solution where SaaS is software as a service?
Yes, actually. So Ascend, for those of you that are not familiar with Siebel Clinical is a configurable product. So what Ascend, if it wasn't conveyed in the presentation today, is a configuration on top of Siebel Clinical Vanilla to take advantage of additional functionality, additional enhancements that we've talked about today. And so we offer that as as sort of an add-on, right, to Siebel Clinical, where if you're implementing it in-house, we would implement the Ascend solution or that configuration in an in-house scenario. But we do offer Ascend as a hosted model as well. So what we call Ascend on Demand is our SaaS solution. So that actually makes it a lot more cost-effective, especially for smaller organizations that have smaller user set in clinical ops that are going to use the system. Basically, you're essentially paying for a per user per month subscription to the use of Ascend. So we basically set it up on our system and we host it. So it is offered in a very price competitive manner as a SaaS solution. So absolutely.
Thank you. Okay, so that concludes the questions that we've got so far. Of course, I invite you, if you have any other questions that you want to pose that you haven't had an opportunity to do so right now, to either pose them as part of the survey that happens at the end of the presentation, or indeed go onto the BioPharm website and look up the contacts there, and by all means email us with any further queries. So that concludes the web presentation we've had for today. I'd really like to thank our two main speakers, Param and Rob, for their really interesting presentations. And I hope you go away with a better flavor and understanding of how organizations need to identify and address risks, and what we can do to help your organizations do to reduce risks in two key areas around management of clinical trials and around management of safety and associated signals around products. So please note that today's presentation will be available on biopharm.com within 24 hours for you to review and share with your colleagues, and we'll send you a link to that as soon as we can. If we can be of any further assistance, please don't hesitate to contact us. Our contact information is on our website. And thank you very much for your participation in today's session. And with that, I'll close the session and you can log off. Thank you and goodbye.